That's better.
Welcome to today's podcast. On the show, we have John Farrell. Thank you very much, John, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm quite interested to see where we're going to go today.
Well, with global citizen life, there's so many opportunities around the world and different experiences that people have. And sometimes people are a little bit scared to get out of that comfort zone, move to a foreign country, go overseas. And I kind of understand that, but I've also done it many times, so I know how wonderful and great it could be. So for me, talking with other people who have done it will hopefully inspire and motivate those people who want to, but they're a little bit nervous about it, to kind of take that leap and enjoy a life around the world.
Sounds like fun. Yes. I've spent many years, decades overseas. So yeah, it's been great.
Well, let's just give the listeners a little bit of background about your story, where you started, maybe a few of the places that you have lived or been to, and where you are now.
I don't think we've got time to tell you the places I've been to. Um,
Okay, well, just where you've lived. How about
well,
that? Where you've lived?
I'll start at the start. I'm from New Zealand, and in New Zealand, this little wee tiny insignificant country, back out as far away as you can get, closer to Antarctica than anywhere else. And in New Zealand, there's a OE, overseas experience. And the majority, 70%, 80% of the population go overseas and they work overseas. So when I left, I could get a 2-year work permit in England, in the UK. So we were sort of encouraged to go overseas. Unfortunately, when my 2-year work visa sort of ran out, I didn't go back home, and I've left New Zealand 35 years ago.
Wow.
I haven't been to the Middle East.
Okay, that's a good way to sum it up. Everywhere but the
Yes.
Middle East.
Yeah.
And so with all of those places, what what are some of your favorite places? Even though I know it's a hard question to answer because when people ask me my favorite, there's pros and cons to everywhere, but there's a few that really stand out. And sometimes they're just for very specific reasons.
Yeah. As I said, I haven't been to the Middle East. How to answer that question? I remember experiences. So going to new places, I get a sense and experience. So it's more about just arriving in new places. It reminds me of a story. I used to run private yachts, sort of 100, 200, 250-foot private yachts, powerboats. So that was a lot of my travel, but I finished that 20 years ago. But I remember one day we were sailing in, we'd been at sea for about a week, and we sailed into Acapulco. Um, and the stewardess on the boat said, "Oh, you haven't been here before. It must be, fantastic. You're coming to a new place." And I was the first officer, and I turned around, and looked at the captain, and the captain said, "It's just another place, isn't it?" And it sort of summed it up. But I really liked Acapulco. I think it's great now because it's still got the aura, the sense, but there's no tourists. Acapulco had its day back in the 80s or 90s or something. But today
Right.
it's beautiful, but there's not the number of tourists. There's still quite a few tourists there, but it's not packed like it is. So I remember, yeah, that sense, that feeling of sailing through the entrance, and Acapulco is a beautiful big bay, and I've sailed in there probably 3 or 4 times since that first trip in there. Cabo San Lucas was a great place. I remember we were there for about 3 weeks. Um, and we went out one day. There was a big traffic jam in the village, literally. Cabo was pretty small back in the 90s. Um, and it was like, what's going on? So we sort of walked up the street to find out what was going on. And there was a set of traffic lights. And nobody knew what to do with it because they switched them on. And they're all, yeah. Okay, now I know Cabo San Lucas is a little bit more built up today, but in those days they put these traffic lights on. They didn't switch them on. They just put traffic lights in, and everyone stopped because they didn't know what to do because they hadn't seen traffic lights before.
Oh,
Um,
that's funny.
yeah, I could go on telling you all sorts of stories. I'm writing a book at the moment, and the first chapter is going to be sort of along that. I'm just sort of it's a draft copy at the moment. My overseas experience started with a civil coup in the Caribbean, in Haiti. And we were going past Haiti, and the steering broke, and we had to go to port, and we got stuck in the dock as a civil coup broke out in Haiti, which happens every 6 months. So the customs guys said, "I'll sign you in and out. Leave as soon as you can." Um, so my book's going to sort of start. This book starts in a civil coup in Haiti, and it finishes with me sitting on the veranda in Myanmar and Burma in a civil coup and having to leave the country again. So we did that a couple of years ago, 2 years ago. We'd been lived in Myanmar for 2 years. We arrived there before democracy, and we went out after democracy had finished. So democracy since the war actually has only been in Myanmar for about those 10 years that we were there. So yeah, that was a pretty interesting paragraph I came up with. Started in the civil coup and it sort of finished in a civil coup.
Hmm.
Been
And
a lot
that's
of
a very interesting places to be at and very interesting times, which
times.
are very different than where you are now.
Mm. Yes, well, we were sort of refugees. I mean, my we were sitting in Myanmar, sort of, do we go, do we not go? And yeah, I mean, it was pretty well established. There was thousands and thousands of foreigners there. It was really changed phenomenally in the 10 years that we were there. When we first arrived, there was a few hotels we could stay in. Yangon is a city of 8 million people. It's not small. But there was only a few hotels we could stay in, so all the foreigners, expats were kept together, and there was a few jobs that we had there. By the time we left, I was managing one of the jobs I had was managing the recreational side of this suburb, this gated community that had been set up with 3,000 keys, 3,000 apartments. I mean, it wasn't small. We had rugby, football fields, bars, supermarkets, golf course, driving range, swimming pools. So it had gone from that extreme in 10 years. So the change was just phenomenal. But to have to leave there was quite hard. And we literally left as refugees. It was sort of like sitting in the veranda having a drink on Friday night, listening to the gunfire across the river in the city and going, we need to leave. So within
Wow.
7 days, we'd packed up everything we could in our suitcases, my wife and myself, and we left to come back to the UK, which we've been in them for the last couple of years. Yeah.
Okay. Wow. That's definitely quite an unnormal experience, shall I say? Very unique with that. Not many people can say that they've had that type of experience. Why did you pick Myanmar to go to or to live at, or how did you end up staying there for 10 years? Because as you said from the start, it wasn't a typical place that a lot of expats would be going to or living at, let alone just traveling for vacation.
When we arrived, there was one hotel, Pan Pacific, that used to have a restaurant. So this would now be 15 years ago. So, 2010, 2010. So not that long ago, there was one hotel where we used to have Sunday lunch, and we pretty much knew everybody, foreigners, because there was a handful of foreigners there. They were in the hundreds. Um, and I was commissioned to bring a 100-foot sailboat into the country and train locals to work on private yachts around the world. I now have Burmese guys working in Germany, Spain, different places around the world. But it was Kipling that said, Burma is like no place you'll ever visit. And my wife and myself, I mean, the experiences we had there, one of the jobs so I'm mostly employed in hospitality. One of the jobs I had was running a 180-foot riverboat. So real 6-star, real luxury, sort of the but lower cabins with $600 a night. So it wasn't cheap. But yeah, I mean, my bread and butter was Mandalay and Bagan. Bagan is where Buddhism started. There's 3,000 temples and they shrines. They can't tell quite how many there are because they keep rising and falling into the sand around Bagan. Mandalay, it goes back to, I mean, ancient times. So that was where I was sort of sailing in and out of on the Irrawaddy. But we also got the chance to go up the river to the Chinese border and then up the Chinwin to the Indian border. The Indian border, there is where the Allies turned around and came back to first start driving the Japanese back in the Second World War. Up the Irrawaddy to the northern climbs up to China is where they in the Second World War, the Allies came from India, from the west, and the Chinese came from the east, and they pushed the Japanese back through Rangoon and then out through out to the end of the Second World War. A lot of the people in that, I mean, bearing in mind, right up until before we left, I mean, this is a country that's bigger than France and Germany. It's got a population of 60 million, so it's not insignificant. They were pushing about 3 million tourists per annum, which is, again, is insignificant in a country that size. So in those parts of the world, you'd run into tanks from the war that had just been left from the war. I mean, this is just in the fields. The locals saw up the rivers maybe less than 50 foreigners in their lives. Friends of mine, they wrote a book. They released a couple of documentaries. Forgotten Allies. These guys that were literally teenagers that helped the Allies fight the Japanese, and they still revered the Queen, and they had no contact. They were waiting for the English to come back, the British to come back to help them. So remote, just incredible. Riding elephants, yeah, that's normal. But these are wild elephants. They come out, they pull the teak logs out of the forest, and we could go for a ride on them down at the beach, on the side of the river. It's the little things. I remember having rice. Rice. Yeah, I mean, everybody's eaten rice. You haven't eaten rice until they take it off the field, and they have these steamers that they put them in. So the rice is air dried, and then they steam it, heat it up, and steam it. It tastes like rice. I haven't had anything like it. Right. The coffee, I used to have this little guy in Yangon. I used to buy my coffee off. So he'd set a little shop up on the side of the street next to the coffee shop. He had a 44-gallon drum of ground coffee, and it was like $2 a kilo for coffee. And I couldn't take it to Australia or back to England because nobody could drink it. It was too strong. The stuff we get here from Starbucks is, can I mention their name? But it's like in warm milk.
Wow, that would be some strong coffee then, because I'm not used to strong coffee.
It's seriously strong coffee. Or you get the pineapples, and you can't eat a bowl of pineapple because it's so strong.
Mm-hmm.
The acid.
That's
and
the true freshness of things that we get when it's local, which is great.
Absolutely. I mean, they don't do organic farming because it is organic farming. They don't know the term.
Right.
So it was a phenomenal place to live, to experience it. And the locals at that stage really wanted to meet foreigners, just to meet them, to learn, to experience what was going to happen, and the evolution in that country from when we were there, where most foreigners would never see most locals would never see a foreigner. You'd go into a company, and I'm lucky my background is coaching. I coach entrepreneurs and business people, and now coaching expats. So that helped me a lot to coach the locals, not to the level of setting goals and that, but just understanding where they were, because the education system is so bad there. You can't explain it. Just because of the situation after the war, the English walked out or left, and the locals took over, and then the military stepped in pretty soon after the war. And Burma at that stage, Lee Kuan Yew modeled Singapore on Burma. The president of the UN was Burmese. It had the best universities in Asia. And then the military stepped in and closed it up for 2 generations. So they just opened it up when we got there. Just after we got there. So it was being in a place witnessing history unfold daily almost. The changes were just incredible, and working with the locals, that was
so even though it was quite some time now, about 10 years ago or a little over, how did the process work for uh, getting residency or a visa, or like how did you manage to that? And could you open a bank account after? How did that kind of like that day-to-day things that when we move overseas that we need to get done, how did that work there back then?
I think so. When I first left New Zealand, I worked on private yachts, mostly in France. That's one of the big bases, but I spent a lot of time in Florida, in Fort Lauderdale, Miami, and I spent the season in San Diego. So in those different places, recognizing as an Australasian, so New Zealand, Australia, South African as well, I think because of our upbringing, because of our lifestyle, we're more flexible. We can put up with more things. So I don't need a bank account if I'm, back in the day, I didn't need a bank account if I was in a country. I spent years in France without a visa because they didn't really, it wasn't a problem. Um, I think a lot of different, a lot of other people, because they're not used to traveling as much, they're a little bit, they expect a bit more of the luxuries, home luxuries, if you like.
Yes.
So it was easier when I was in yachting, and then because I stayed outside New Zealand, I sort of got used to what was going on in Thailand. We lived in Thailand for a couple of years, and Thailand is a little bit more formalized. But because as an expat in Thailand, to have a job, the company has to show that a local can't do it. And for every expat they employ, they have to employ 5 locals, which is a good idea. So
Hmm.
the position I had, I was an agent bringing in ships, cruise ships to Phuket. Um, so there was a lot of communication and just understanding. You sort of you start running before they start coming down. You're flat out because their time span, their timeline is really short on a cruise ship, and it's critical.
Right.
So that's why I was there for a couple of years, and so because of that, it was relatively easy to get bank accounts. But yeah, this is 20 years ago, and I mean, it's not easy in the West anymore. I don't know about the States. I think I still have 2 bank accounts in the US. But today in England, in Britain, it's really difficult to open a bank account.
Really?
It's nigh on impossible. You've got to have a you've got to have a you've got to have local bills, rates, power or something. But to pay a power bill, you've got to have a bank account. But you can't get a bank account unless you've got to be paying rates. So how do
Oh, there's so many places that have that vicious circle that you can't have one without the other, but you can't get the other without the one.
And so going to Myanmar again, it was lucky, I think, because the fact I'd been overseas, because you could do anything in Myanmar if you knew the right people, pulled the right strings. I say we left New Zealand. It took us a week to get sort of packed up. I mean, it was 10 years. It took longer for us to take our. Well, she's not here now. A Burmese street dog from Myanmar to England.
Oh, yeah, that would have been a process.
It was, yeah. I mean, this is sort of just on the tail of COVID. So that process was finding the company that could transport by road to the Thai border and then sit at the Thai border for a couple of days till we had the right border guard who would slip them across. Yeah, bit of tea money. And then our dog Mango went to Bangkok and she stayed in a hotel for about a week until she got the flight to London. We just flew from Yangon to London. It took her about 10 days to fly. She had more air miles than most humans at that stage. But that was also most of that was done through people So bank accounts.
Mm.
Myanmar at that stage, it's obviously it's had to catch up with the rest of the world. The company I worked for in Myanmar was a shipping company, and they ran about 300 ships around the world, mostly crewed by Burmese guys who were paid in that country huge wages. But an officer or an engineer would be paid about $800 to $1,000 a month, which is gold dust there, but obviously to us it's not much. But because they're on the ships, they couldn't get their money back home. There was no transaction of money. There was a lot of the banks, Chase Manhattan, still have things in place where you couldn't transfer money in and out easily. So the company was a German company set up in Cyprus, and what they would do is they would take the wages in Cyprus and they would transfer on paper the money to Yangon. And in Yangon, the families would come into the office and they would get paid in local currency. So $1 US is worth 3,000 chats, the local currency. So the families would come in. One family would come in, $800, and it would be a wheelbarrow literally full
Oh, oh
of
my
wages.
gosh.
And just before I arrived, they had a cyclone went through Yangon, and it broke the back of Road to Mandalay, which is a famous cruise ship, German cruise ship that used to ply the river. And it broke its back, and it had several 100,000 liters of diesel on. They had to sell it. They had to do the transaction at the hotel because it was the only place big enough to get the shopping trundlers full of cash through the door, counted and out, and it took a day to count the money. So the company I worked for had a
Wow.
room full of cash, but there was no security because you didn't need any security. So yeah, at that stage, banking wasn't so easy. Trying to get money out today is it's not worth trying. There are banks, and I can hold US dollars or local currency down there before we left. But yeah, the banking system was very archaic. Um, it's you
But
sort of
ironically, I mean, you
fit
figure it
in.
out, right? Like it's one of those things that and obviously when you first got there, we're going back quite some time too. But it's those things as you learn how the system works, you work within the system. It's very different. It's opposite now, as you say, in the UK, where you need to have, proof of
X, Y, and Z.
bills and all of that kind of stuff. But again, you get to know the system, you do what you need to do, and you work within the system. We can adjust very well that way.
And I think it's easier and harder in the West because you know what you have to do. You either do it or you don't do it. In Thailand, Myanmar also, but a lot of Asia's this way, where to get anything done, you've got to know somebody local.
Hmm.
So really important that and it's I learned this a long time. It's not the language, it's the communication.
Okay.
And you get a lot of expats go into places like Thailand, Myanmar, um, who think they've said something. And because the job I had was actually training these guys, so I had to work with them on a social level as well as the technical skills of a ship, of a boat. It was the social skills, so they would could enjoy themselves when they're overseas, or just sort of not die of boredom or heartache. So I really got to know them, and I would stand there and watch them with another foreigner, and the foreigner would say something, and I didn't speak Burmese, but I would have to take over the conversation to make sure that they understood what this other foreigner wanted, because they were saying something in English, and then of course the foreigner, the expat, would get frustrated and talk in a louder voice, and yeah, it happens all the time. But it was the communication that was missing, and so yeah, so we learned all these different ways. I used to sit down. We used to have lunch in the shipyard, which was pretty rudimentary, was wooden benches sort of thing, but we would sort of discuss stuff, and I'd say something, and then I'd say, look, you need to discuss this in Burmese, and then tell me back what I've said. So I would help them improve their English, but also for me to understand what was going on. And
Right.
I'm from New Zealand, so we play rugby. The Rugby World Cup's happening in France at the moment. You're
It
American, so you
is.
don't
I
know
was
anything.
actually just in France
Oh, okay.
and yeah, I was in Nice for a few days. So yeah, it was
Most
very
Americans would have
busy.
never heard about rugby, but rugby's an international game like football. But
Hmm.
an interesting thing, because when we first got to Yangon, there were so few foreigners there. There was a couple of bars, but not that much organized. And so what we did, me and another Kiwi and a Scottish guy, was to form a group to play rugby, just touch rugby, just sort of Saturday afternoon sort of things before we had a few beers. And we used to get 100 people turn up to play a impromptu game of rugby. And then I realized that what I needed to do is to get these guys, these local guys I was working with, to get involved in this, to socialize with the foreigners, because it's the social aspect, help the communication. Um, and that made a huge difference to their interaction. One of the guys, local guys, didn't play great rugby, but he got involved in the rugby. And then the coup happened, and just before the coup happened in Myanmar, he applied for a scholarship to go to Japan, So he comes into me and he says, "Look, I've got all this stuff, and I'm going to the Marine Engineering College in Tokyo or Osaka, I think it was." And he filled it out, and I said, "No, on the last page, you need to put down I play rugby." And he said, "Oh, yeah, okay." So I put that down. He said, I talked to him months later. He said that was all they wanted to talk about.
Wow.
He got a scholarship to go to university for a year. He's been there for 4 years. I
That's
mean,
fantastic.
it's great because you really don't want to be in the country now, especially as a young
Right.
millennial sort of local, because they've experienced the world opening up. They haven't so much experienced the shit that's happening there. Sorry, my language, but it's really
Mm.
bad. They say that 6,000 Ukrainian civilians have died in the war in Ukraine. More civilians have died in Myanmar, but nobody hears about it.
Right.
So he was lucky because he played rugby, because he talked
Mm.
to me, because he put that single sentence and he was off, right? So one of the big things about being the expat, and rugby helped that, we had a rugby pitch in Yangon and a football pitch, and the local guys would come and play football, and then they'd leave and they'd go back home, whatever. The expats and the locals would come and play rugby, and they'd play for half an hour. Then they'd come and sit down, have a drink of water, because it's 45 degrees Celsius, which is what, 110.
So hot. Yeah, something like that. It's just way too hot.
So we'd play for 20 minutes, and they'd come down, sit down, maybe have a beer, have a drink of water, and then go out and play again. So the game would take a few hours. But in this sitting down, the expats would actually talk to them rather than a manager employee relationship. It was, we're playing a sport.
Right.
Um, and it
We're equals
changed.
now. We're communicating
Exactly.
as friends.
Exactly. And the communication changed, and it helped the local guys, but it helped the expats as well, because, okay, this is a different relationship.
Yeah.
It helped them so much to understand much more about what was going on. And it helped the locals realize also that just because an expat said something, it's not what they meant. You actually had to learn to ask, the locals had to learn to ask the questions so that they understood. You know, it was Covey that wrote the book, Seek First to Understand and Then Be Understood. Well, the expats got it the wrong way around as a rule. Um, so the locals, I was sort of pushing them to understand. Don't say yes, because in in Asian culture, if you say yes, the other person smiles, it's all right. It's all cool.
Hmm.
So the expat would say something, the local would say yes, the expat would say, "Oh, okay, you understand, right?" And they'd be off. And of course, the local would be like, "Yeah, he smiled. Everything's great. Nothing had been
Right.
done." So
And you have to be careful because sometimes that can run into trouble because somebody says yes. If they're not understanding, they don't know exactly what they're saying yes to. And it could be meeting later for a drink or a coffee or help doing something. And you said yes, and all of a sudden they might be waiting or not knowing where you're at. And then you don't show up. Now you're not such a nice person anymore.
all the
So
time, all the time.
it's
In Myanmar,
it
worse,
happens
but
a lot.
Asia, in Myanmar, it happened most of the time. In Asia, it happened, but not as much. But yeah, absolutely, because it's a different type of social relationship that Asians have that we don't in the West.
Hmm.
So you tell somebody to do something, they say yes, they go away and they do it.
Right.
Asians are looking for the relationship. The Westerners don't have that relationship. It's like, I'm telling you to do something, go and do it. There's no relationship to it. Um,
Right.
and so, of course, it puts, the expat gets upset and the local gets upset because the relationship's not there, and that changes their, sort of how they
Hmm.
relate to other locals as well. So it's a lot of turmoil involved in that.
Well,
Um, I
it's
mean,
important. It really is important to understand the culture where you're going to. I mean, we're never really going to understand it until we're in it. We can read about it and things, but that's the one thing about moving abroad is once you're somewhere, you really need to understand how things work and accept it. The reason why we leave countries, whether it's our first country, second country, whatever it may be, when we leave, generally we're looking for a change. We want something different. And we can't, nor should we expect to have the same things. Like for me, when I left Canada, whether I was in Costa Rica, in Spain, Montenegro, wherever I am, I don't expect things to be like they are in Canada, because if I wanted them to be like they are in Canada, I should stay in Canada. I want to experience different lifestyles, different things. And sometimes it's frustrating. Sometimes
That
I don't
that's
understand why some places do some things and it just doesn't make sense,
yes.
but that's just the way it is.
That's sadly that's an unusual. I think I agree 100% with you, but it's sadly it's an unusual sort of take. People, you know, the Brits go to Spain, to the islands of Spain,
Mhm.
and they go to the English beach where the waiters on the beach speak English and it's English beer and English fish and chips. And if you get lost and you go to the beach next door in Ibiza, it's German. And the waiters speak German and it's German beer and it's German food. So I think that's because when I left home, not many people travelled, so it was a big adventure. Whereas now, with Sky Blue and EasyJet and that, we can jump on a plane for a couple, not maybe nowadays, but a few years before COVID, you could jump on a plane and go to lots of different places, and so you had people took those expectations with them. They didn't.
Yes.
They they expected to find their creature comforts in these new places, and then got annoyed because they weren't there. What I was
Right.
going to say was it was fascinating. I spent a lot of time in Florida and Miami and in Fort Lauderdale. The difference going to San Diego, and I'm going,
Mhm.
this is America. What the? So yeah, even within a country, um, subtle cultural differences,
Oh,
um,
absolutely.
and I think it takes a certain amount of self awareness to notice what's going on. To pick up on that, the subtle difference is like in the States, but when you're in a completely different country, I love France. France is fantastic. I lived in Antibes, just south of Nice, for years,
Okay.
and it not so great on Antibes. Oh, well, because it's the biggest yacht port, super yacht port in the world, which are predominantly run by English speaking, so Australasians and Brits. Um, I think there's 8,000. There's more than 8,000 English
Wow.
speaking locals in Antibes. Antibes not a big place. It's yes, it's
Hmm.
a fraction of the size of Nice. It's
And
the only
Nice is not
place.
a big place either.
No, exactly. It's the only place in France where you go to the supermarket and all the signs are in English and then French. The French
Oh, wow. Of
want everything to be in French, so they had
course.
a few years ago. The government brought out a rule that you couldn't start calling things by their English names, like computer, la ordinateur, or fish and chips.
Okay.
No, Fritz. So they put all the English names out and referred them back to France. But on tape, so it was really difficult to learn French. I don't speak French. I lived there for about 8 years
Okay.
because the only way that the local French businesses could become involved in the boats was to speak English or to
Yeah.
employ somebody that spoke French and English, and they would interact with the boats. Um, and it was something like three-quarters of the industry of the town, because obviously yachts pump thousands, millions of dollars into the local community. It's the second biggest industry in the Côte d'Azur,
Wow.
yachting. It's massive. So the French but in Antibes, with all that money, with all that control in the English-speaking community, they had no say in the politics. So every now and then you get this curveball thrown in, and it came up a few times, but yeah, it's a fascinating place to live. But that's I live in England, and of course they have the rules and regulations, the European rules and regulations. Now the UK's out of it, but one of the rules I remember was that, because we used to run a hotel here, was that they brought in the anti-smoking regulation. You couldn't smoke in the pubs. First time I ran into it was at a marina in San Diego, and went to the bar to watch the Super Bowl, and I hadn't watched a NFL game before, and there was a break in the game, and I could walk to the bar. It emptied. Everyone went outside to have a cigarette. It's a few years ago again. So it was just at that stage. So in England, it was like that. You go to a bar and it'd be full, and then something would happen. Everyone would go outside and have a cigarette. In France, all the signs are up, but you can't see them because they're covered in smoke and they're covered in the French just ignore it. I'm going to smoke where I like. That doesn't it doesn't. So you expect to go to a beer station, a beer shop in France, and the guys are sitting there with their coffees and the cigarettes in the morning. So yeah, in England they have the rules and they keep to them. Sort of like they're policed. In France they have the rules on the wall, but nobody takes any notice
They're
of them.
not policed as much.
Not policed at all. I love
Right.
France. France is a great place.
There's,
Great food.
there's many great places that I love and I enjoy. I love Italy. I really enjoy France. Spain is fantastic. Costa Rica is beautiful. I mean, there's just
Yep.
it's tough sometimes for some people to perhaps pick a place. So if people were maybe kind of torn between places or they have in mind a place or two that they would like to go, but they're just nervous, just scared, what kind of advice or what would you say to them if they're on the fence about kind of taking that leap and moving abroad?
I was what I was going to say was that I call them Club Med tourists, Club Med expats. When I saw a lot of them in Myanmar, they'd fly in, they have the 2 year stint with the company, they'd fly in, they'd do the job, they'd sort of know the locals, but they wouldn't really know the locals, and then they'd leave. They spent 2 years in the country, but they never really learnt about the country. So it's really important wherever you go. Um, I mean, Costa Rica, yes, I could tell you stories about Costa Rica, but to actually get in with the locals. Don't go to a place and go to the local beer station, the local pub where the Americans are, or the Brits are. I mean, you can't not go, but don't just go there.
Right.
Actually,
Mhm.
actually go to the places that the locals go, because going on holiday for me, life's experiences.
Mhm.
And it's actually going to these places and going off. One of the rules I have is, if you go to a place and the restaurant's full, that's the restaurant you need to go to. If the one next door is empty,
Yes.
there's a reason. The locals are not going there. Or if it's full of
Hmm.
tourists, don't go there, because A, the price will be high, and B, it's not authentic. It's going to be, like, I live in England and Indian food here is fantastic. Now I've been to India. Well, yeah, Indian food here is English Indian food. It's not Indian
It's
food.
right. It's just not the same. It's absolutely not the
It's
same.
it's chalk and cheese.
And another one that somebody said to me one time too is with restaurants when I first moved to Spain was don't go to a restaurant where they have pictures outside showing what they sell because that's just
Ah,
a
for the
touristy
tourists.
place and don't go there. So that's also another good
I
one to
have
stick by.
I have lots of rules, and one of the rules I have in Spain is, if there's sawdust on the floor, that's the restaurant you need to go to.
Mm,
So fantastic. It's
yeah.
this restaurant I went to in Barcelona, and it wasn't a restaurant. It's actually, we used to go for drinks Friday night, and it wasn't really. It was two buildings, and there was a road between the middle, and they just blocked off either end of the road. And in Spain, they have all the hams hanging upside down and the
Yeah.
umbrellas to catch the fat, and so the ceiling was just legs of ham. All they served was champagne, sort of like
Oh,
$5 champagne, $10 champagne, $20 champagne by the glass. So you could pick and choose. Well, that was all they
mhm.
served. Sawdust on the floor, and you were lucky if you could get in. There will be 100 people there, but it was only
Wow.
open sort of 4:30 to 7 o'clock. So just sort of when you're
Just
about
that
to
after
finish
not
work, before you're
hmm
going to the restaurants, and you'd meet all sorts of people there, locals, because you had
yes.
to you had to know the locals to know where to go to find these places.
Right.
Um,
Right.
well, I don't know. I don't know if you go overseas. Yes, you need to find out what the locals are doing. I was
Mm.
in. We're just outside Barcelona, and we're in this little village up in the forest, and it was really hard to find. It was a tiny village. There was about three restaurants, and two of them were closed, and this other one had restaurant, but it looked closed. So we knocked on the door, and there was not really any signs outside. There's no pictures outside, definitely, and there was a sign. So we knocked on the door, and the owner opened it. And she didn't speak English. She was speaking Catalan,
Catalan. Hmm.
but it was obviously a restaurant, but it was a little bit sort of bigger than just being their house, but it was sort of looked like it was their house. So she go, oh, wait. So she called her daughter out who was in the kitchen, and she spoke a bit of English, and she said, oh, yes, we'll put a table aside for you. There's not really a menu. You just have to eat what we're serving. That was about
Oh,
20 people. It was quite, it was quite busy. It was a restaurant, but it was just so
perfect food.
take the risk and go to those
Mhm.
places that, yes, don't have the photos outside. And lots of loud music. I mean, we didn't really, the door was closed. There wasn't lights on or anything. It just had restaurants. So, we should try this place. So, you know, it's not until
Sometimes
you
it's the least
off.
obvious that's the
Yeah,
best.
yeah. Take the risk, because then you're going to experience different experiences, and they are the
Right.
things you're going to remember. Um, not going to the restaurant in Spain that serves fish and chips. You're not going to remember that.
No, no. You want to go and have authentic food wherever you're traveling to, and to go where the locals go, to meet locals.
Yeah.
Um, that's the best thing. And if even if you're staying at a hotel, ask the person that one or a few of them, or ask somebody in housekeeping or something,
Ask the
where do you
housekeeping.
go to eat?
Yes, ask the
Where do you
housekeeping.
go to eat? And they will give you an honest answer of
Yep.
what is good and what they enjoy, and then be open to that type of food. If you're Spain, it's Spanish, Italian, Italy, like wherever you're going to be, then you're truly getting
Yeah.
that local thing. And if you're moving, it's the same type of thing. Get to know the locals and participate
Yeah.
in their festivities and parties and whatever it is, after work, drinks, after dinner, coffee, even though I don't drink coffee that late, but you can still have something like, but just, yeah, it makes the experience different. And the whole part, I know that a lot of people say is, we want to move, or we're thinking of moving for whatever the reasons are. They want to change, they want something different. So enjoy the difference.
And I
Enjoy the
think
new culture, the different things.
you do have to sort of find some fellow expats,
Hmm.
because you do need that little oasis to sort of touch base with home, if like every now and then.
Yes.
Because I know as an expat, we lived in Thailand. Before that, we were in England for a few years. Then we went to Thailand, and that was quite a cultural shift, going to live in
Hmm.
Asia. And I thought, well, okay, we're going from Thailand to Myanmar. That shouldn't be too much, but that was probably the hardest place I've been to live in Myanmar, because there were so few expats there.
Hmm.
As I said, it was in the thousands, and we used to meet lots of Sunday lunch was great because we'd meet lots of expats. So you do need that breathing space. Um,
Hmm.
that it can be hard, the cultural shock of traveling, and I think cultural shock can be really hard. So I was I was quite, my wife came with me. So my wife's English, so I met her in France. We went out to dinner in Italy. We went to a nightclub in Spain. We got engaged in Florida. We got married in England. So yeah, we traveled a little bit. But it was hard for both of us. But we both sort of found a way of working in finding our local context. So it's really important, if you're a couple. It's even harder if you've got kids. But if you're a couple, to make sure that your partner actually has some connections, some relationships that they develop with the locals, and not just the woman that comes around and does the cleaning. They can join groups, that sort of thing, because
Hmm.
it's really hard when there isn't anything to do and you can't go out. In a lot of these places, Myanmar, when you got there was no TV. Thailand was a bit better. You had 100 channels, but they're all cheap, sort of, foreign language stuff. So that was quite hard. My wife rides horses, and a few years ago I bought her 2 horse riding lessons. I'm not quite sure how we ended up owning 2 horses. If you know anything about horses, you'll end up owning a couple of horses. So she worked through in Thailand. She was riding, and it was quite cheap. And then she met people and developed relationships there
Hmm.
with the locals. Um, and then we went to Myanmar, and she did more riding there, and that in itself was just phenomenal. Um, we went to Bagan, which is an ancient city. I mean, you're talking thousands, 3,000 years old. I think they've still got relics from the Pew era. Um, So we went there we took the horses there for a big an equestrian competition. Been 25 years since I'd seen this before. It was the end of the season. So it's quite patriarchal. So there was three women riding, and they did the dressage where the horses dance around and the boys did the horse jumping and the racing, and that's just how it is. So it was end of crop season. So the owners put on a big meal for the local pickers of all the crops around, and they included it in this equestrian event. I mean, there was only 50 or 100 horses. It wasn't a big event, but of course they'd never seen it before. Plus the food was there. So it was 10,000 people at this equestrian event. They sort of knew that horses raced and they hadn't really seen them jump, but dressage, totally different scene. So they had to get the three women on the horses so they didn't sweep the horses into the arena together. Now, I say arena, it was a piece of sand with some posts marking out a square, and they had four layers of people. They had the kids kneeling down, squatting really low on the ground. They had the next layer up, kneeling up. The next layer up was sort of squatting and almost standing, and the next layer was standing, and then the next layer was. So there was 1,000 people around this arena in silence. Just could hear a pin drop. And the Burmese announcer was explaining what was happening. And of course, these people had never seen horses dance like this before and perform as they do in dressage.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, yeah, she got a lot out of interacting on a social level. So it wasn't a job. She was actually just training and working with some of the horses and then going to events like that. So, I mean, she was the only foreigner there. They interviewed her for TV, and one of the guys that I was training had to translate for her on national television. The sort of thing that no other expats would have even known was happening at the time. So sort of work with the locals, find out some of the things that are happening. Even in Thailand, there's expat foreign clubs, there's foreign correspondence clubs, that sort of thing.
Everywhere there is now, especially with social media. There's Facebook groups, there's meetup groups, there's everything.
Finding out,
but you don't want to depend on those. That's the thing, is if people start with that, it's fairly easy now in most countries to find an expat group, but you don't want to fall into the trap of being just in that expat group and then miss out on a lot of cultural things and traditions.
So much you got to see. We lived on Phuket, which is a little island. My job used to take me from one end of the island to the other every day. So my father came out and stayed with us, and we stayed on the east coast, which is the inland coast. My aunt, his sister, came to stay, and she stayed on the west coast. And she stayed for a couple of weeks, and he stayed for a couple of weeks at different times. When they went back home, they had nothing in common. She'd been on the commercial holiday resort west coast with the ocean and the beaches and the expensive ice cream, and he'd actually seen the island, and yeah, they had nothing to talk
completely different experiences.
And they're only 20 miles apart.
Wow, it's incredible.
So yeah, because I worked there, I knew lots of the locals, so we went to the local places. It can be a little bit frightening, but that's part of the enjoyment, is actually trying to communicate and trying what they're eating and trying what they're drinking and finding out what's going on. Myanmar rum is an acquired taste because the army drink it, and it's full of quinine for the mosquitoes, for malaria. It's the sort of thing you try once or twice. But you've got to trial these different things. In Fiji, they have kava, which is the local root that they form into a juice, a drink that's an anesthetic, so it numbs your mouth. But you would never see that unless you were socializing with the locals,
right?
So yeah, it's sort of getting off the beaten path and not expecting that you're going to have a hot shower and CNN or BBC on the television every night, experiencing what's going on.
That's right.
France. So we lived in Antibes, which was always really busy in the summer and the high season, and that's, again, it's just fantastic going to the local restaurants, the local places, because they're very different way of approaching life, even though we sort of call them Western France, that the English is not a first language. And they won't speak English. I always found this in France. They won't speak English till you try and speak French, and then suddenly they speak English. But they won't speak
Because
English
they
until
want
you
to make sure you're
try.
at least going to try. You've put in some
Exactly.
effort.
Yeah,
You know a few words, even if they're pronounced not great, or you say something that you totally didn't mean, then they
yeah.
laugh. But at least you're
Then you're off.
trying and you put in the
Exactly.
effort.
So yeah, it's exactly. It's putting in the effort. It's meeting the locals. Trying. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say there's any
Well,
particular place. I mean, as I said, I haven't
it's
been to the
hard.
Middle East. Africa's incredible. I haven't been to much of Africa. Central America, Panama is phenomenal. I have the record of being the only foreign captain to take a boat through there during daylight hours.
Wow.
We were sitting at the dock in the morning, and the pilot comes on and he says to me, "This is the power of yachts." Comes on and he says, "Okay, we've got the paperwork sorted out." I said, "But you can't leave until 7 o'clock tonight." And I said, "No, we're leaving during the day." And he said, "No, no, yachts. It's a 140-foot yacht. Yachts aren't allowed to go through. It's for container ships." And I said, "Oh, okay. Just a minute." So I got the owner was coming through with us, so he was on the boat, and I said, "Oh, this is what's happening." He said, "Oh, just a minute." So he died, and he gave his phone to the pilot, and the pilot said, "Yes, Mr. President, it's coming up now. Yes, yes, get the anchor up." So yeah, we got sort of the
About who
pilot.
you know. It's who,
Absolutely. So yeah, I
who
mean,
you know.
and until you're working with the locals. I mean, that's a bit extreme, but you're working with the locals. You see
Mhm.
some of the local stuff. We got stuck in Panama City on the boat again, and we blew part of the engine up. So all the guys are stuck in the engine room, and my wife and all the interior staff basically were watching television. I said, "No, you're not going to get back to Panama City again. You need to get off the boat. Go, leave." So they went
Right.
out and they came back and she said, "Oh, we went to the zoo." And I'm like, "Okay, all right. Well, that's interesting." She said, "No, no. We were caged in and we had this tunnel to walk through that was covered in netting in the forest."
Oh.
So they were the ones in the zoo walking through the forest and yeah,
And the animals were just wild animals all around.
just absolutely. That's why the wire netting was there.
Nice.
But in that case, it was like, no, get off the bed rather than sit here, and that's important.
Hmm.
When you go to a country, don't sit in the hotel and go to the hotel restaurant. And I mean, in Myanmar, my best time of the week was going to the local market. And we get there at
Oh,
6 o'clock in the
yes.
morning,
The
and then
local markets are always fantastic.
I don't, I had these women there who I used to buy off, and they couldn't speak English, so it was sort of like, "Oh, we'll do this, this, and this," and then I'd have the local soup, which was fantastic. It was really nice, but it really meant something. The woman that produced the local soup for all the shopkeepers to have a foreign. I mean, there was no other foreigners there, so to have a foreigner sit at her restaurant. I mean, I'll use that term loosely.
Hmm.
Whole different day for her. And then the women that I used to go and buy all the vegetables off, they would have a great time. I'm sure I paid like 100% more than everybody else, but that's life. But
Sometimes that
just that
happens.
no communication in English,
Mhm.
but I got what I wanted and they got what they wanted. We had a great time. That's really
And it's
what it's
something
about.
that's talked about. Like we're talking about it now. They were probably talking about it at different points throughout their life. Kind of the first foreigners who were there were the only one that
Yeah,
started out, and it becomes something that's interesting and different for them to talk about as well.
yeah. But I suppose the one place I would encourage everybody to go, not now, is to Myanmar because there is no tourists there. I mean, 55 million population, and they got up to 3 million tourists. I mean, Fort Lauderdale gets 3 million tourists. That's a city, um,
Yes.
and Yangon is pretty well set up. It's really inexpensive, but you're actually I don't have a bucket list. I mean, what's the point of a bucket list? If you're going to put it on your bucket list, you should be doing it. But there
Right.
is one place that I want to go. There's a huge delta there, and they have these 12, 18-foot saltwater crocodiles.
Okay.
And I don't think my medical insurance would cover the trip, but you actually go out, you stay in the fishermen's huts. You have, I don't know quite how you keep rid of the mosquitoes, but you make sure you're covered in mosquito stuff. Um,
Mhm.
And experiencing things like that, that would be one thing I have on my bucket list. I don't think I'll do it, but Myanmar would be the place I would say people need to go. It's not luxurious. Are there parts of it that are luxurious? I mean, there are 6-star hotels. But the boat that I was running um, was 6-star. You know,
Mm.
but they're little pockets. Most of it, you sort of, you know, they have the riverboats where the locals, and you can go on them, um, where you don't. There's no seats. You buy your square meter on the two decks,
Oh,
and that's where you put everything in your square meter on the deck, and they go up and down the river. Um, real
wow.
not for backpackers. I don't think, not for people looking for parties. That's Thailand.
Mm.
More people for experiencing, and a lot of Myanmar Burma is quite nostalgic for people, retired people, because they remember it as Burma, something that came out of the war, the Second World War.
Right.
Um, and there are elements of that around the city, around the country. So if you actually want to get off the beaten path, we had a couple of people come in with on the boat with us, and we ran out of internet connection.
Mm.
The world was going to end. Especially we had a Facebook influencer on the boat. She knew
Correct.
this. She knew we were going to lose internet connection, but she didn't understand. And then we almost had to put her off the boat, but we couldn't because there's no roads. We're on the river. I
Right.
don't know. I don't
So
know
that
what.
would be a great place for people, very adventurous people to go to.
Yes.
Obviously not now. Hopefully things get better
Yeah.
there soon. So,
I think
and
that's a
so John, I
while.
know you said earlier that you do some coaching and things like that. So if people did want to get a hold of you, what would be the best way for them to be in touch with you?
I coach expats. About both my wife and myself coach expats, and I find it the biggest thing about being overseas, even though you've got phone and Zoom and all that, is that you start to get homesick. You really do. And, you know, that's the sense that you've lost something. And expats coaching really helps to first of all, with understanding themselves better, sort of getting to have that sense, and then experimenting, getting confident to go out and meet people, but also becoming aware of what's happening at work. You know, most expats have gone to a different country to work, to do a job, and they've got to understand the locals. This is understanding before you're being understood, and depending on how far away the culture is, as I said, from Florida to San Diego, there's a difference there. But if you're going
Hmm.
from the States to Europe, there's a huge, even from the States to England, there's a massive difference separated by a common language. Um, it really takes some self-awareness of what's going on when the miscommunication's happening, because
Mm.
90% of our communication is non-verbal.
Right.
And that's something I work on with expats to get them aware of the subtleties of the non-verbal communication that's going on. So I work with lots of expats and in businesses in that realm, in that field. The best place to get a hold of me is on LinkedIn. I think you've got the link, but
Yep, I'll put it in the
on
show notes below for
cool.
everybody.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the best
Yeah.
place to get a hold of me. And I work with business, obviously. My wife tends to work with business as well. She works with government departments, because
Okay.
a lot of government departments, the FCO, the Foreign Office in the UK, they send people to foreign countries for a term, like 2 years or something. It's the same with
Hmm.
America, all
Hmm.
government departments. So people tend to they go and they work. So my wife was involved with the embassy. So a person would go to the British embassy in Myanmar, and the only locals they'd meet were the staff that were cleaning the house, or maybe the cooks, or that sort of thing. So they really had to make a point of going out and meeting the locals. Um, and they end up in this little protective bubble. And then they go
Yeah.
back home, go back to New York, and they say, I've spent 2 years in Myanmar, I know all about the place. And I'm sitting watching the guys on CNN or BBC, or CNN's great. And you're thinking, this guy, there's a classic. There was a guy there that used to report just before the coup happened and the build up to it, and he was reporting from Thailand. He'd never been to Myanmar, but he was the spokesman for CNN. I'm thinking, yeah,
Oh,
hey,
that's awful.
you haven't been in the country. You're not in the country. You've never been to the country. But he
Yeah,
was
that's
the
bad.
leading spokesman. So a lot of people and businesses as well, especially private businesses, need to understand the culture. So it is,
Mm,
and it's not, yeah, coaching in that sort of realm is just, it's sort of day to day almost, just sort of, so what am I going to do today? What little sportsmen are very good at it. It's not right. It's not the goal. It's can I do better today than I did yesterday? It's those incremental
right,
little steps that move us from A to B, not let's wait until B appears and I'll jump to B.
right.
So, and there's lots of expats struggle with being away from home, basically.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
as I said, especially their spouses, their partners who go there with them but don't have a job to go to and really don't know anybody
That's
except
really hard for the yeah, the spouse or partner.
and yeah, and then you have the problem with the relationships that yeah, and then if you bring children into the mix, that can get even harder. They end up going back home to boarding school, or usually what you find is if the kids go to a local school, they integrate really fast because the
Hmm.
locals are there. They learn the local language, they interact with the locals. Children can be a great leveler. Um,
Yes. And then the
but
families connect too, because the kids, whether they have extracurricular activities or things that are going on with the
exactly,
school, then the parents connect, and it is an easier way to connect with others.
exactly, and I think you because we live now in a village outside Manchester in the UK, and your world view is the sum total of where you've lived.
Yeah,
And if you've lived in a little village, then that's your worldview. If you've lived in Manchester, it's a bit bigger, obviously. If you've lived in a couple of different places in the UK, your worldview is still in England. And
right.
traveling and living overseas just changes your whole perception of the world. Um,
It really
you realize
does.
I've realized that Asia's the powerhouse. Everyone in Asia is so much more positive. They're so much more upbeat. And I'm really frustrated. I have a Huawei phone here. Smart. You can't buy these in America or England
No,
because
no,
they're
you
half the
can't. I
price.
used to have one. I used to have one. I got it in Spain, and when I got to Canada, they're like,
Yeah,
"What? What is that?"
they're half the price and they're twice as good as a normal phone. And they're as good as an Apple, but they're
Mm,
20% of the price. So, and so I mean, that's technology, but just traveling overseas just gives you such a different worldview. No,
mm.
I'm fascinated sitting here in England watching your political system can I say unfold or shall I say collapse in America? And when
Yeah.
you step outside and you watch what's happening inside the country, you realize the same thing's happening in England. I don't know. You probably can speak to Canada better, but Canada sort of, yeah.
Well, we're not
I'm
we're not
from
doing so
this.
great in Canada either. Like, let's be
Well,
honest.
yeah,
No, nobody's really doing that great right now. Just it's the level of who is worse, and I don't want to win that race down.
yes, yes, and it's so. If you're in a country, if you grow up and your worldview is England, then that's your worldview. And America looks
Mhm.
well, they're being stupid. But when you actually travel around, you realize, well, no, that's just where they are, and there's good and bad, as you said right back at the start.
we I find we truly get propaganda of our own countries better than everywhere else, and we'll show bits of how every other country is bad or worse. And even though there's some bad stuff that goes on in ours, at least we're not as bad as others. And it's like every country has that their own propaganda that goes that way. And then once, as you said, once you're out of it and you realize that,
Yeah.
like it's like a
Wow.
whole world opens up that, oh my gosh, there's amazing places, great things. What the news was saying about this place or this religion or these people is so not true. Or
Yeah.
there's a handful of them and they're saying they all are the entire country or whatever. And it's
Yeah.
absurd. And that's why I also think it's good for people to not just travel, because when we travel, we live in bubbles, but to truly, when you move and you
Hmm.
spend time somewhere and you integrate, you
Yeah.
see how much good and better that places are and people are than what we see and hear on the news and TV.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it was fascinating, even me and living in Myanmar, because there's so much more amateur. You know, the government would do this presentation on the state television, and down the bottom it'd say, "This Windows is an illegal version." On state TV. Or when the coup broke out, they had this woman doing yoga, sort of morning yoga. They do this in Myanmar,
Mm.
morning yoga, and behind her, the tanks were rolling down the main street. It's like, well, okay, they got that one wrong, but yes, and I think it's the way the world's going, and I think the millennial, the younger generation, are pushing it. They're much more adept at being social nomads, and when they
Mm.
get overseas, they realize, you know, here in England, the medical services is not helping, but I think my wife has asthma, so she gets the asthma
Okay.
inhaler. Costs her a couple
Hmm.
of dollars. I think it's $10. How much does it cost in America? $300 for the same thing.
It's absurd. It
And
really
you
is
and you,
absurd.
but if you live in your little bubble of your country, you think, oh, that's the norm. And then you go
Right.
overseas, and then you go back and you, well, no, I'm not. I'm not going to vote for Donald Trump, or well, I'm at,
I was just at a conference and people were like, "What? The taxes are how high in Europe?" And I'm like, "Well, it obviously it depends on the money you make, and there's a number of taxes, capital gains, real estate, things like that." I mean, people are like, "What? That's absurd." And I just said, "But you pay those taxes in the United States too, and you're paying for healthcare.
yep,
So if you take out what you pay for healthcare, maybe you put it towards actual taxes if the rates are a bit higher, you're still having a better quality of life, doing more things, and you have better health care, and you're at least probably at par on what you're paying or still paying less to
yeah.
have a completely different lifestyle and just culture and it's I find the US too is very work live to work as more of Europe is work to live.
Yeah,
So we work less, enjoy time more, enjoy the outdoors more. Like lunch is at least an hour and a half to 2 hours. Dinner, we don't rush. You rarely
right.
do I ever see somebody walking around eating anywhere in Europe. If you're going to eat, you sit,
Yeah,
even if it's just a croissant, you sit down and eat. People aren't walking around while they're eating,
yeah.
rushing to their next meeting. It's time to eat, you sit, you eat. And there's just more enjoyment in that. And there's adjusting of that slower paced life. But most reasons people are tired of how busy they are. They want the slower pace. And then it's some adjusting to that slower pace.
And yeah, when you go to Asia, you have to run at that slower pace because the rest of the
Mm,
population isn't going to change for you. So it's
right.
you get involved in that culture and you recognize the good and the bad. I mean, there's no country.
Of
I don't think
course.
there's any country better than anywhere else. I'm
No.
from New Zealand, and New Zealand has some fantastic benefits, and everyone seems to want to go there except New Zealanders. The biggest export from New Zealand is still New Zealanders, um, because it has its problems.
Of
The
course,
rest of the
every
world,
place does. Every place has their pros and cons,
yeah,
and what's acceptable or non-acceptable or a deal breaker, however we want to call it,
yeah,
varies for every single person. Some people think Spain is the best place. Some think Italy is the best place. Some think Malaysia is the best place. Some people think New Zealand's the best place. There's other people that think the United States is the best place. It's all I think it all comes from where we come from. So depending
mhm,
upon where we live, the things are either different, bigger, or better is what we think, or more opportunity. And that's not necessarily the true case. It's because it's what we see in the media, on the news,
yeah.
the internet, and sometimes reality is a little bit different than our expectations. However, there is no perfect place. I'm searching. I
It's
haven't been to as many countries as you, but I'm still
no,
searching, and I've come to the conclusion there is no perfect place. Everything is a bit
it's
of a give and take.
it's no, and absolutely, it's your worldview. And when you've
Hmm.
lived overseas and you've experienced different things, your worldview changes, and it's where
Absolutely.
you are. What do you want? I think that's a great story. I was telling you about my wife. We met in France. We went out to dinner in Italy. We went to a nightclub in Spain. We got engaged in the States. We were in that many different countries in that short period of time. And you just realize that nowhere's better than anywhere else. It just depends what you're trying, what you're doing in the moment. If you're
Mm.
bringing up children, my cousin was was the youngest a partner in one of the big law firms in the UK, and his kids were preschool, and he's driving home one day. He's half a day on Sunday, stuck on the M5, N25 in London, and he goes, "This is crazy. You know, I get to spend this half a day with my children, and we're stuck in traffic." So he went back to New Zealand because at that stage,
Hmm.
that was his focus. And New Zealand has, really good medical service. It has free education, and the kids could go to the he got stuck in traffic going to the beach on the weekend, but he had the whole weekend, so it didn't matter so much. In England, it was
Hmm.
stuck in the motorway sort of thing. So it depends where you are in life. If you're a little bit older, I think
Absolutely.
Europe's fantastic because I love France, Spain, Italy, cruising on the rivers, just sitting, having paella because no one in Spain eats at 7 o'clock in the afternoon. Yeah, afternoon, it's 10 o'clock at night. But they don't get
Right.
up until late and then they have their afternoon siesta. But that's actually
That's
enjoying
right.
life. Um,
Yeah.
and then and then in Asia, there's just so much more energy there. I think there's so much keener. It just seems to me that's where the focus, the energy focus, is starting to move. Um, it still has its political problems, Myanmar particularly, but most of the countries there are ruled or they have a huge military influence, which is sort of good and bad. It
Right.
has its good
Yeah,
points and bad points. Well, if you're sitting in England, you go, no,
exactly.
you don't want the military involved. But in Thailand, the military steps in every 10 years or so to kick all the corruption out. They say, right, we're going back to point A, going to kick all that stuff out, you're going to start again. And the businesses, the hoteliers that I used to know loved it because now we know if we pay some money, we're going to get the service. We don't have to pay money and then a bit under the table. So in Thailand, they do this reset every 10 years or so. So every country, but yeah, it's where you are, where you've experienced. The first digital nomad I met was a woman. It would have been in the mid late 90s. She was a computer programmer on a yacht. She had a 40-foot yacht. She had a big satellite dome on it, which looked a bit strange on a little sailboat, but she would do all her programming and send it back to the UK, to the US. And she was going around the world. She'd been doing it for 18 months, and we met her in Papua New
Wow.
Guinea. So,
Wow.
you're going into villages that see two foreigners a year. Um,
Hmm.
and she was having a ball.
Yeah.
She was quite
It
happy
is.
by
It
herself.
is what we make it.
She was with
Life is what you choose and what you make it. And I say to people too, if they're really concerned and worried, of course, go check out a place, go visit for a few months. Um, and and then once you move, like honestly, the worst case scenario, absolute worst, you hate it, can't stand it, it's horrible. You can always leave. You're not
right.
stuck. You can check out somewhere else. That's maybe a bit different, move to
Yeah.
a different country, a different destination, or you could always go back home if that's what you prefer. But
Can you ever go
it's
back
like
home? Once you've been overseas, home's never gonna
I've
quite be
I've
the
heard of
same
a few
again.
situations of people moving back. I think that they just didn't give it enough time, or
Mhm.
maybe the destination wasn't quite right for them. But for me personally, I left Canada in 2011, and I mean, I never want to say never, but I'm never going to move back, at least not full time.
But if when
Who
you go back,
knows what may happen in the future, but I hate winter, hate
oh
winter,
yes, I live in the
hate.
UK. What happens when you
And
go back home? What do you talk about?
um, it's a little bit tough because I I don't want to always talk about my travels and everything that we're doing, that I'm doing. My friends and stuff are interested in it, but sometimes I do have some concerns of how it comes across. But it is
Mm,
my life, and I have made sacrifices. I miss birthdays. I miss dinner parties, Christmas, Thanksgiving, all of those things.
mm.
So it is about what's going on in my friends' lives, how their work is going, what their plans are, what they're doing. I mean, and they do ask me too. My friends are pretty good, but I just have now a handful of very close friends that I've had for, I mean, all of them I probably had for at least 20 years. Family's a little bit different. but it's just the way it is. I enjoy it. They know that I'm doing my thing, and I'm always says like I always say to them, you can always come visit me. I go back to Canada every single year. Every single year I go back and visit. Um, and I say, you can always come visit me as
and
well
visit.
wherever I'm living. So,
It's one
but
of those
it's
things where I realized because I went overseas, left New Zealand, and I went back there a few times, and my brother got pissed off, so he followed me overseas, and we used to go back, and it slowly dwindled down, so we'd only get back every couple of years because they're living in their bubble, their worldview was New Zealand,
mm,
and we would go back and they were interested in what we're doing, but France was a little wee country miles away. I remember I got on the tube going at Heathrow going into London one day, just spent the summer in the Mediterranean, and there was a woman who was on another boat, and we knew each other quite well. So we sat in the tube, rush hour traffic into London, talking about the sort of the Italian food and what was happening in Italy and what was happening in Greece and what was going on in France, and not just about boating, but just about the sort of the culture and what was happening in these different places. And you could see all these guys with their newspapers sitting on the tube, just getting more angry because that was their life. They would go into London and come back out again. So yeah, it can be difficult in those relationships. I've been lucky because most of my family's, pretty much all my family's lived overseas. So if we talk about different places, we've got some connection. But if you've got a group of friends that have lived in Canada and they've never been to France, it's a little country and they've got no
and it's
concept
far
of it.
away, and it
Yeah,
might be
and
nice to visit,
makes
and
nice wine. And that's
yeah.
sort of about
There's
it.
the Eiffel Tower, yeah, it can be a little bit. So I generally do on some occasions I definitely downplay my travels and where I'm going and what I'm doing. Um, so it kind of sucks in a way because there's times that I do want to share all the fun, cool things that I'm doing and stuff like that. Like no, it was actually just a few weeks ago. It wasn't even last month. I was in Barcelona and I decided I'm gonna check out Nice because I'm interested in finding more about France and visiting some more places in France and doing stuff there. And so I just hopped on, like I booked a flight for the next day and went to Nice for 4 days
You
and
should have
came
caught the
back and
train. You should have caught the train.
well, yeah, but because I was only going for 4 days, it
Okay.
was an hour flight
Takes
or
a while.
9 hours on the train. But I do plan on doing more of the south of France because it is so close. And I will definitely be doing the train. Because it was last minute, it
Yeah.
just,
It's a
time
lovely
and
trip.
cost, it was cheaper to fly than
Mm.
take the train. So,
One of the things I did right back at the start was whenever I went somewhere was to collect a recipe, a local recipe.
oh, okay.
And so when I go home, and we have you had blackened fish? Do you know
Yes.
blackened fish? Yes. So the
Hmm.
guy in Fort Lauderdale developed that, burnt the fish one day.
Okay.
And we were in Fort Lauderdale when he was doing that. This is back in the early 90s. And so we went to the restaurant a few times and got chatting to him, and I got the recipe and I took that home. So I didn't have to talk about Fort Lauderdale when I was back in New Zealand. I just, I'll cook on the barbecue.
Hmm.
So that's something I've sort of tried to collect in different places. I mean, I love cooking and I love food and Thai food, Myanmar food, not so much Indian food, not British Indian, Indian food
Right.
is fantastic. French food is it's just different, no, and Italians.
It's just also different. And when you're there, and it truly is because, like, a tomato grown in Canada, grown in Costa Rica, grown in Italy, even if it's the same brand type of tomato, it does not taste the same. The water's different, the soil's different, the sunlight is different. So
Yeah,
it does taste different. So not only what they're using and making, but it's the true flavors of the food there that is also different. And yeah, it's just better. It's just better.
the thing I like about Italy is that it's not just the food. It's the family. So okay, we're
Yes.
gonna have this and this and this wine and this wine and then you. So it becomes a cultural thing, an experience again, even though I'm back in New
Hmm.
Zealand, it's not just the food.
Right.
It's sort of
I
expand
love
on it.
Italy. Hmm. It's one of my favorites. Well, John, I think we should probably end on the food note because I
Okay.
feel like we could continue talking for hours. But I really want to thank you very much for your time today and sharing some of your stories. I'm sure listeners got a lot of valuable information about lots of different areas today.
Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, I think we went a little bit over, but we
A
covered the
little bit.
world.
That's okay. That's all
We
right.
covered the world.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time.